How long have you been practicing law?
Well, here it is, May 2024, so that would make it 50 years.
It's a long history, so I want to go through all of it. But I want to start kind of towards the beginning, but at a really dramatic moment. That 1976, Governor Blanton is governor, and you have your first legal job at the Attorney General's office, and you're assigned to the parole board.
In one of his last acts as governor of Tennessee, Ray Blanton, a target of a federal investigation of an alleged parole selling scheme, has cut the sentences of a number of murderers and other convicts. Bruce Hall has the details.
The FBI has filed affidavits with a federal grand jury saying that Governor Ray Blanton either had knowledge of or participated in a scheme in the governor's office to sell pardons to state prisoners. Last month, 3 of Blanton's aides were indicted in the parole for pay scandal.
I was new in the office, and they would assign administrative agencies to assistant attorneys general to represent. And since I was so new and nothing ever happened at the parole board,
Until 1976.
Until 76, they said, you can represent them. And I said, fine. So I learned about parole law. And so the governor appointed Marie Regente, who had been his extradition secretary, as the chair of the parole board, of all things. Marie was very young. I think she was in her 30s. Really smart person, very attractive young lady. And she became the chair of the parole board. So I worked with her on parole issues. One day she comes to me and said, I need to talk to you. I said, what is it? What issue have you got? She said, I think that the governor and his legal counsel are selling pardons.
What ran through your head at that point? You're 26 or 27 years old?
27, 28 years old. And she tells me this, and I had known her for a year or two, and we had a very nice professional relationship, and she tells me this, and I'd always met with her in her office, because she was functionally Attorney General's client. She comes to my office in the late afternoon, and I was in shock when she said this, and what ran through my head was, this is Watergate. Because I had lived through Watergate. It hadn't been that much longer. And I listened to this, and she explains to me how she knows this and how she's getting all this pressure to parole this person or write a pardon for that person. And then she's talking to some of the people who are the defendants getting the pardon and their families, and it turns out they have to pay $10,000 or something like this. And the money goes to Eddie Sisk, who is the governor's legal counsel. And she's telling me all of this, and I listened, and I was astounded that she had this knowledge and that she had come to me about this, of all things, because she didn't know my political allegiance, so to speak. Of course, the Attorney General's office was independent. So she told me this, and I listened to her, and right there on the spot, I had some collateral information that something like this was going on, but nothing involving that high. And so what happened was that the governor, Blanton, corrupt as all could be, had its patronage chiefs in every county to get things done. And I heard rumblings about this. So I called Richard Fisher, who was a district attorney outside of Chattanooga, who's a Republican, because the DA in Nashville was a Democrat, who I trusted completely. She was terrified to talk to a Democrat because the governor was a Democrat. So I called Richard Fisher, told him about it, and he said, this does not shock me. He said, I'm going to call the FBI. So I tell Marie, we're going to get the FBI. Hank Helen comes to my office a few days later. He's an FBI agent. Excellent investigator. He talks to Marie, and then they issue some search warrants in the governor's office. That's how that started. And just to kind of fast forward through all of this, they investigated it, and then it died down, and then Sisk did it again, even though he was under investigation. And this time they had marked money, and they arrested him with marked money. And so there's a criminal prosecution goes on of him. The governor is tried for selling liquor licenses. He goes to prison and all of this. And as this is going on, Governor Blanton decides he's going to pardon people with reckless abandon, money or no money.
With only 4 days left in office, Blanton stunned the state with a middle-of-the-night announcement that he had granted executive clemency to another 52 prisoners, including 26 murderers. And he says he is not through yet.
I don't want to discuss cases with you. They'll be on record and they'll be on file, and there'll be some more.
So far, Blanton has released more than 650 prisoners during a stormy 4-year term.
So I'm in the middle of all of this as this thing is going on. Marie, they make a book out of her. Peter Moss writes a book about her called Peter Moss. I'm in the book.
Governor Blanton, have anything to say for us today?
Not today. Soon after, Blanton's administration would begin to unravel. Top aides would go to jail for allowing convicts to buy their way out of prison. Blanton himself would be convicted of selling liquor licenses. And Marie Rajanti would gradually disappear from the public arena.
It was very amazing to be in this. Sis comes to the Attorney General and wants to be fired because I'm making these accusations against him. Brooks McLemore is the Attorney General. He said, I would have fired you if you hadn't done what you did. But it was, I'm in the middle of this firestorm. People are interviewing me, the police are talking about all of this. And obviously this was not right. This was corruption at the highest levels, and I'm 28 years old. That Marie was arrested for DUI. I was invited to the same party. My wife said, you're not going to that party, and I didn't. There was an allegation that she and I had an affair. I said, when did this supposedly happen? Well, that was the day Kay and I were on our honeymoon. I mean, they did everything to discredit her and certainly trying to discredit me. And I just said, you know, I'm going to do what's right.
I had been run out of town on a rail.
August 1977, Parole Board Chairman Marie Rajanti is fired by then-Governor Ray Blanton, amid rumors that she's begun to cooperate with the FBI's cash for clemency probe.
But it was amazing to have this window on power at the highest levels of the state and to be involved in this. And of course, Watergate is just everywhere in this situation. So fast forward, one of the people, Marie's aides, was murdered over here at the Capitol Park yet. And the suggestion at the time was that Blanton's people had him killed. And we thought that maybe. And that's a big deal in the book, Peter Moss's book. Fast forward a couple of years, turns out I'm down in the DA's office. I prosecuted the two guys that killed him. Had nothing to do with Blanton. It was a robbery. So Moss is all upset with me that I've ruined his story by prosecuting these people, and I've sold out. He writes me out of the movie. And so my movie career is gone. I'm teasing, of course. Fred Thompson plays himself in the movie, and that's how he got his start. But this whole thing was exhilarating. To be a part of this and to keep your wits about you while you're doing other things and to have this incredible experience as a very young lawyer. Looking back on that, I watched some of the videos that we pulled up from back then. It was like it happened yesterday. I can remember how I felt. I can remember what I saw. And all of this stuff was swirling around as a young lawyer. It was an amazing experience. It certainly changed me. I became a lot more skeptical of government. I certainly didn't believe everything the government was. But I still am an optimist. I think we can do better. I thank goodness that Governor Alexander and the people around him for him and early and stopped this. But that was an amazing time of my life.
Is that still the most exhilarating experience you've had as a lawyer?
No. I've had multiple exhilarating experiences. They're different. But what was different about this, I'm a lawyer for 2 years, and I think I'm just going to do, cases, appeals, is which I was hired for. And wham, I'm thrown into this firestorm. And I wanted to make sure I survived it and always did the right thing.
And Marie, I understand, gifted you a book after all of this. What did it say, or what did she write in there?
It's a book by Leon Jaworski, who was one of the prosecutors in the Watergate case. It's called The Right and the Power. And she sent me the book, and she said, to David Reagan, a person who knows the difference between what's right and the power. And she signed it. And that meant a lot to me.
Your father, Van Raybin, was a child of Jewish immigrants, Russian immigrants, and worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and then met your mother in Frankfurt, Germany. Can you tell us that story?
Sure. Dad was an engineer, and he worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard during the war as an engineer, helping to build, teaching people how to build boats. And he was such a valuable employee, they refused to take him into the Army. He was desperate to get in the Army with all his friends. No, you're going to be in the Navy Yard. So eventually, he went into the service right as the war was ending. But after the war was over, the United Nations, part of the Marshall Plan, was desperately afraid that Europe would become communist. And they wanted to resurrect the industry in Germany and help the refugees learn the trade, and also the Jewish people who survived, and teach them trade so that they could go to Israel. So Dad was asked to go to Germany and help teach a skill, and he taught automotive engineering. And he was assigned to a little town right outside of Frankfurt. His secretary was my aunt. And it was through her that he got to meet my mother. And Mom said she didn't want anything to do with my father because she was leaving for the United States. And so she was going to go. She was a telephone operator because she can speak 3 or 4 languages, and which is very useful. But anyway, so she had to have these wisdom teeth taken out, and there was no appropriate medication for that. And so her sister said, the only thing we can do is get whiskey. Fine. Who do you know has whiskey? Well, my father, he could acquire anything. He got this whiskey. He said, I want to see this. So he took my mother and her sister to the dentist, and she had her wisdom teeth taken out, drunk as can be. So she said, well, this American's not too bad. And so that's how they met and came to the United States. And they lived in California, and then they went to New York. And it was just an incredible marriage, incredible love between the two of them. And then I was born in California, came to New York. My brother was born there. And but Dad was the child of immigrants. His father and his grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi. And his parents got married right around First World War. I think my grandmother was like 16 or something like that. And grandfather, Max and Rose, operated a candy store. My grandfather had bunches of businesses, and we have the census from back then, 1920 census. And there it is, Max and Rose Rabinowitz Confectionery at the candy store.
So it went from Rabinowitz to Raybin.
My father's name was Rabinowitz, and then after the war, right after the war, he couldn't get a job anywhere. He was Jewish, and he had Rabinowitz, and because it was obviously his name, he changed the name to Raybin. And many of the people who were Rabinowitzes in my family changed it to different kinds of things so that he could get a job and work without the prejudice of being Jewish, which there was a lot of prejudice at that time, anti-Semitism going on. So he changed the name from Rabinowitz to Raybin. And so we've grown up Jewish in my family. I was bar mitzvah, and my brother and my sisters bar mitzvah. And so that's part of my culture, having that religious background and everything. And of course, we talked about, have I experienced anti-Semitism in my life? So, I got the lies from my mom. I'm proud of my religious heritage a lot. I think that's important to me. That's part of who I am. But fortunately, I've experienced relatively little of that. I've seen it in the world. I've seen other people be very anti-Semitic. That's why I feel so passionately about racism or anything that goes for people, who they are, what they believe, or what they look like. That's just wrong. But that's part of my history of how I grew up. And then we went to Virginia. Lived in Virginia. I went to military school. We lived in a little town outside the city. And my father said the education system here is just dreadful, which it was. So he sent my brother and I to a military academy, which I went to for 6 years.
What was that experience like?
Well, I was literally a child when I started military school. I mean, it was there for the education standpoint. But then later on, I got into the military part of it, really, really enjoyed it. I thought that I learned a lot. I learned discipline, self-discipline. I learned how to give orders, how to take orders, and be regimented, as it were, to be in a military thing. It was good. I learned a lot. From that, it was a wonderful experience for me, being in the military. There were very few military academies left in the United States. But as I was graduating, Vietnam was coming along. And so I graduated from military school and then went to the University of Virginia as an engineer. My dad was an engineer. Well, I'll be an engineer. I was there 6 weeks, Amy, and I said, I hate this. I cannot stand this. Dad likes being an engineer. I cannot live this way. So I left. And so then I went to a community college, finished the year out, and then I went to Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and I graduated. And while I was there, I worked for Philip Morris in the psychology laboratory, teaching rats how to smoke. We would do experiments on rats so that they would like this cigarette or that cigarette. We would do consumer testing. I loved it. Wanted to be a psychologist, I think it was. So I ended up marrying one. But I really enjoyed that. And then while I was in college, I was on the honor council, and we had this terrible honor code violation. So we said, well, consider it, but somebody has to present the evidence. So we had this draw straws as to who would be the prosecutor, and I drew a straw. So I was the prosecutor, and one of my professors was an attorney. So I got to him, so what am I supposed to do? And I got to meet this lawyer, and he kind of told me that. So, of course, the student had a real lawyer to defend him. And, of course, that was my first trial. I was killed, of course. But it was from that I said, maybe I don't want to be a psychologist. And then I love teaching, but I don't want to go be a teacher. Maybe I'll go to law school. So it was from that experience, just draw out of the hat, so to speak, that I went to University of Tennessee Law School.
And why University of Tennessee?
Well, they accepted me, first of all. There was the baby boom again. I'm competing with thousands of other people to go to law school, medical school, any kind of professional school. I got accepted to a couple of law schools, but one of my roommates went to UT, and then I'd heard about it. I never even visited the school. I'm so happy just to get in any damn law school. And so I started law school at UT.
And at one point you said you were on the verge of quitting.
I was.
Why?
It was like when I was in engineering school. I had the foresight to say, I got to leave engineering school. I hate this. I was in law school. It wasn't that I hated it. I just didn't understand it. I was totally confused. I didn't know what it was all about. And I told you this when we had lunch the other day. I'm walking across the lawn, and a bolt of lightning strikes me. And I had this epiphany. all of a sudden it all makes sense. There was a certain symmetry to the law. This course and that course, they were all disconnected. Just a bunch of rules. It made no sense. All of a sudden, there was an order to it. There was a reason for it. And I just understood from the time I walked out of my room till the time I got to the school, I kind of understood what it was about. And once I had that epiphany, it's almost impossible to describe. But as I said, law school rewires your brain. I hadn't been rewired yet. And so I got rewired, and I just loved it. I just really understood it. And that's when I got into what's the reason for the rule? Why is the rule? Because law school is issue spotting. That's all it is. What are the issues there? What's the answers? So by knowing what the history is, what the rule is about, it helps you. And so I really, really, really enjoyed those. It was a lot of work. I was terrified I was going to flunk out. UT was terrible back then. They would have hundreds of kids, and they would flunk about every week. Somebody would leave.
And while you were at the Attorney General's office, I mean, you worked on a lot of big things. Another big issue was the death penalty at the time. That Tennessee Supreme Court had eliminated the current statute, and then you're given this monumental task, again in your late 20s, to rewrite Tennessee's death penalty statute. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. We had all this litigation involving the death penalty, and the Supreme Court struck it down again. The legislature said, we need a new death penalty statute. Came to the Attorney General, said, we need a new statute. And Attorney General called me in and said, Ray, you're the only one who knows anything about this. You've been dealing with this for years. I want you to write a statute for the legislature. So
You've been dealing with it because you've been doing appeals.
Correct. I was trying to defend the indefensible, the death penalty law as it was on the books. And the U.S. Supreme Court knocked out comparable statutes. So we had to have a new thing. So I met with colleagues all across the country who had exactly the same experience. And we found a statute that we thought would pass constitutional muster. And I drafted that particular statute. Blanton vetoed it. The legislature overrode the veto. It became law. It's essentially what is on the books now. But that is how I began my legislative work in writing statutes, is dealing with, I testified in front of the committee. I had to write the statute in a certain way. I had to meet with staff as to how statutes were written. So although I was dealing in the judicial branch, this was my first taste of the legislative. We had discussed the death penalty statute and I helped draft that as it discussed. Years later, the death penalty was implemented by lethal injection. But at the time, a person could elect to be electrocuted, because that was the law on the books at the time. And a prisoner decided that he wanted to be electrocuted instead of lethal injection. A lot of problems with that. The electric chair had not been used for 40 years. So they brought it back, and I was appointed to represent him. The law requires that the person have an attorney in case they want to stop the execution for some legal reason. So I'm appointed to represent him in the first electrocution in Tennessee in 40 years. I remember one of the media people calling me and saying, Mr. Raybin, they're bringing back the electric chair. Yes. Is it safe? Well, of course, what she meant was, is it going to work? But it was just absurd, these questions that you were getting about this archaic method of execution. So I went to the prison. One of the people that I've represented for years picked me up. There's a limousine service. So he said, I'm going to take you to the prison. And so he brings a stretch limo to pick me up at my house. I get to the penitentiary, and people thought it was the governor who had arrived. And it's just me. I pop out. I said, it's just me, and there's a lot of pandemonium. They don't know why I'm there. So I go into the prison to meet with the client, talk to him, and we went through conversation, made sure that all of his rights were being respected. We walked to the electric chair, and they put him in, and I'm literally 3 feet from him while all this is going on, while they're preparing him for this. And they put this hood over him and everything. And I decided right then that even though electrocution might be instantaneous, the torture of this contraption and going through all of this archaic stuff is barbaric. And so eventually, when everything was in place, I moved into another room with the reporters. And the telephone was right there that I could call the governor if I had to, call the court. And they didn't allow any papers or pencils or anything in there because they were afraid of recording. And I made a record of it in my mind as to what actually was happening. And then there was this giant noise. It sounded like a gun going off, and that was the bolt of electricity. And all the reporters jumped, as it were. And it killed him instantly. And then we went outside. This man had killed 4 children. And certainly, he was also a Gulf War veteran. I was not there to defend him per se, but to make sure that his rights were being respected by the procedure, and that he wasn't subject to any inordinate torment. And so I wrote an article about what it was like to witness this, because there was no film or anything of it. And as I said, I came to the conclusion that that particular method of execution is barbaric. Did it change my views on the death penalty? No, because I think that in the most extreme instances, an extremely horrendous kind of set of facts, I think that the death penalty should be available to make a statement that what the person did was so wrong. Is it a deterrent? Of course not. Is it a species of retribution? Perhaps. But it has a place, and in the few times in Tennessee we've abolished the death penalty, it's always come right back. So if it's used, it should be used sparingly and with all the due process in the world. I also think that you want to have a level playing field between the prosecution and the defense so that there is a fair trial and the procedures are honored. You don't have defense lawyers who paid virtually nothing to defend somebody who's charged with a capital offense. So with those safeguards in place, in a rare instance, perhaps it should be. I've wrestled with this question, but I still feel that in rare circumstances where due process is applied, it may be something that the states could reserve for itself. Now, if I were legislature voting for it, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But as an attorney, that legal issue will be resolved perhaps in another century or two. We may always have it.
And did you enjoy that, working in the legislature?
Really liked it, but I've been doing that now for almost 50 years, and sometimes it's exhilarating, it's fun, and other times it's like a town hall meeting. It's very frustrating to deal with them because you have all these various things going on at the same time, and you have to be very wary that you don't fall into being a tool of one of these legislators. So as a result, I've drafted a lot of legislation, which then, when we get into that, it then led to the we work on the Class X law.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Crime was out of hand. And
this was in the 80s?
This was in the 70s. This is a Class X felony law of 1979, I think it was. And Bill Koch is now, who I clerked for when I went to the Attorney General's office and eventually became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was Governor Alexander's legal counsel. And he said, crime is out of hand. We need a new crime law. So he and I came up with this Class X law. I mean, it was the most draconian thing you ever saw. It did away with parole. It had a little thing we put on the stores. This place is protected by Class X, and there was a little marker, and I've shown you what that looks like. It was an amazing statute, and it was a disaster. It locked up the work. It was a disaster. The prison population went through the roof. And so we did that, and along with some other legislation, we had riots. We had riots, prisons were being burnt down, people were being killed. It wasn't just the Class X law, but that certainly contributed to it. I was prosecuted by then. And so then the governor said, we can't have this. Special sessions called in as Bredesen. And the lieutenant governor appoints me to the Sentencing Commission. And
So now we're in the 90s.
we're in the 80s. 80s. That law came in 1989. And I worked on the Sentencing Commission for 9 years, and we came up with a law that's still on the books today. The legislature's slowly destroying it. But it was a rational sentencing system. We had grids, and we had population projections. So all this legislative work that I did, starting on the death penalty and going through all of these statutes, you see how the criminal justice system changes in the legislature based on various public pressures, people wanting this and people wanting that. The Sentencing Commission, I think, was the high point of my career in the legislative activities because we did something very positive. We also rewrote all the sentencing laws, wrote all the substantive laws, redefined all the codes. We changed from jury sentencing, which was madness. The jury would find a person guilty or not guilty, and then they would sentence them. So we came up with a statute, which was kind of a hodgepodge, taking the power of jury sentencing away, giving it to the judge, like almost everywhere else. That sort of worked okay, except it wasn't coordinated with the definitions of the criminal code. And so that's why the Sentencing Commission was a far superior project, because it considered sentencing and the definitions of the crime as a cohesive whole. So you went from chaos with the Class X law to some reform with the abolition of jury sentencing to what I consider to be the best sentencing law in Tennessee, was the sentencing law of 1989. I'm proud of the work I did. It wasn't just me, obviously. Barbara Haynes was appointed as the chair. At the time, she was the only woman on the commission. She was absolute terror. She put in a good way, and she made this commission work, and we had a great thing. It didn't hurt that her husband was a state senator. So that's how that came to pass.
What did that teach you, doing this legislative and drafting work, and how did that affect your career later as a lawyer when you were in the courtroom?
First thing, it taught me compromise. Legislation is all about compromise, of give and take and doing the right things. And no one person can make the correct decision. You have to have a committee. It is interesting, having participated in that. I would be in the courtroom and the judge would ask me a question about a certain statute, and I would tell him what it was, or I think it was the judge, what the statute said. He said, well, let me see the book. I said, well, Judge, I don't really have the book in front of me. He said, well, what are you quoting from? I said, memory. I helped write that statute. And that gives you a tremendous edge. Knowing what it is, it gives you the history of how the statute came to be.
The other thing that you did at the AG's office, which you sort of touched on, were appeals. And that's something that I understand from talking to you that you've always loved. Why is it that you really love appellate work?
That's the first thing I did. Remember, I passed the bar on a Wednesday. And the next morning, I had a case in the Supreme Court, which another lawyer was going to argue because I wasn't sworn in yet. So the next morning, I appear in front of the state Supreme Court. They swear me in as a lawyer. I march over to the table and I argue my first appellate case.
Wow.
I love doing appeals because it's so many moving parts. You're trying to uphold or reverse what happened below. But the part that I find exhilarating, you write the brief, is arguing the case in front of 5 very smart people in the Supreme Court, or 3 if you're in the Court of Criminal Appeals. And you're all alone in the pit. You've got all these questions coming at you from various directions. You only have 20 minutes or 30 minutes to make your argument.
And back in the 70s, you didn't have the timer either, right?
You didn't have the timer. You had to know what it was. And so I had a little clock or a stopwatch there, and they sort of kept time. And so you're arguing this in front of very smart people, and you're having a debate, and you're answering questions, and they want to test you on what it is you're saying. That is an out-of-body experience. I mean, I teach appeals to lawyers, and I can't explain it, how you're supposed to do this, because once you do it, you're done, and you say, oh, gee, I should have done this way, or I should have done that. And there's a certain delivery that you have to have. And there's a certain cadence that you have to have, and you have to be aggressive and concede what you have to concede. But it is an amazing thing, and I've done appeals now for literally 50 years. I still really, really enjoy it, the experience. In many ways, people say, you know, jury trials are wonderful, and they are, but it's a different thing. And I think doing a really important appellate case is the pinnacle of being an attorney, because you really couldn't change the law. Some of the cases that I've handled have changed the law. I mean, the jury verdict one way or the other helps one person, right? But an appeal, like when I did the battered woman thing, that makes a big difference across the state and for the future, for better or worse. And so you're not only arguing for your client, you're arguing policy. That's what I do. And I argue and appeal. I try to find out what is the policy behind this rule or that. How did this rule come to be? And that is the thing I think that is resonates with the judges. They want to know, why is the rule this way and why should we change it, or how was the violation?
When you went to the Attorney General's office, were you assigned to the criminal division?
I was hired specifically to do criminal appeals. Amy, we didn't have divisions back then. We were so small. When we would go to lunch as a group, that was the whole Attorney General's office. There was no divisions back then. All I did was criminal appeals and represent administrative agency, do habeas corpus kind of cases. But I was hired specifically to do that at a law school.
And did you think when you graduated law school that you would make a career out of criminal law?
I knew I needed a job. This was the baby boom. To get into law school was impossible. To get a job was impossible. I applied over 100 places to get a job, and I'm competing with hundreds of other recently graduated people. I really wanted a job desperately. I applied all kinds of jobs, and this job came along, and one of my professors said, "This is what you need to do." So I did that almost exclusively because I needed a job. And when it was described to me exactly what I would be doing, I thought, wow, this is a great fit. My professor said, "Yeah, this is what you want to do." And did I think I'd be doing that for the rest of my life? No. But I needed the job. I enjoyed doing the work. And I sort of made it my thing, as it were. I really loved it.
You said that during this time at the AG's office, you met and worked with and worked against some really great lawyers in Nashville, members of the bar. What are some of your memories?
Well, back then, because I was handling these cases in the Supreme Court, the case would only be in the Supreme Court if it's usually important. And so the lawyers on the other side were the best lawyers in the state. Jerry Summers, Bob Ritchie from Knoxville, Walter Kurtz, just absolutely stellar attorneys. And I learned how they approached things. They were my adversaries. And so I learned a lot from them. And many of these people became lifelong friends and colleagues now that I'm in private practice.
And how did your work in those early years at the AG's office affect the rest of your career?
It was like a postgraduate course. My son clerked for a federal judge. That's a great experience. And I think when you get out of law school, you've got to do something else. It's like education or some other experience. Being a law clerk for a federal judge is a great thing to do. Working for the Attorney General's office is practicing law at the highest level when you're very young and you're doing some really important things. And so it was functionally a postgraduate course on law school, because law school, I don't know whether you say it teaches you anything, law school rewires you. That's all law school did for me. It rewired my brain to think in a different way. I learned craft as or in the Attorney General's office, and it was postgraduate work functionally.
And what are some of the most memorable cases that you argued at the AG's office?
The cases that I argued in the AG's office there was an insanity case where we were trying to change the
McNaughton.
McNaughton rule, which was an archaic rule. Chief Justice Henry, who was like General Patton.
And you've described when Chief Justice Henry was the Chief Justice that it was a magical time at the court. Why do you say that?
He was such a personality. He wanted the justice system to improve. It was archaic. He said, criminal law has got to get out of this. We got to have new things. He advocated for criminal rules. I got on the Criminal Rules Commission. I was the youngest member of that. I remember I had to go off for pizza for whatever it was we were doing that day because I was the youngest. I was a kid. It was a magical time. All the justices of the Supreme Court were newly elected. They were dynamic people, and Henry was the leader of this group, and he just wanted things to be his way. I mean, he was exactly like General Patton. I think he was the head of the National Guard at one point, rode around in a Jeep with pistols like Patton. I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. I loved it.
And before we talk about your journey to the DA's office, when you were an assistant AG, you invited DA Tom Shriver to come sit with you at an appeal, and that had never been done before.
This involved a famous case of String Bean Ackerman, who's a country music star. He and his wife are murdered in Nashville. And it was just an incredible case. Tom Shriver was the district attorney. He prosecuted the case himself, got a conviction. And then the case went to the higher courts. Somebody had to defend that. And so Tom asked the Attorney General if I could do it. And I said, yes, I'll be happy to. So I worked on the state's case to uphold the convictions. So I met Tom Shriver. That was how I met him. And when we argued the case, I said, Tom, you're going to sit next to me when I'm arguing this case in the Supreme Court. Well, district attorneys are a whole separate animal from attorneys general. They sit down in the audience. I said, you're not going to sit in the audience. You're going to sit next to me because the judge might ask me some question that I don't know the answer to, and you're going to sit right there.
But what did he say to you when you told him that?
He said, are you sure? I said, absolutely. It's never been done before, but we're just going to do it. And so he sat to my right. We went through the case, and it was helpful, but it was dynamic to have the district attorney and prosecutor sitting there. And they knew he wasn't going to say anything, but he was a lawyer, was allowed to sit there. So that's how I met Tom Shriver. We got the conviction from him. And then some months later, whatever it is, Tom picks up the phone, calls me and said, David, I've got an opening down here. Come down and want to hire you as an assistant district attorney. So I asked my wife about this. And
First you said no, didn't you?
That's right. I said, Tom, I really appreciate this. I love what I'm doing. This is a lot of fun up here. Thank you. I'm so flattered. Well, I had offers from other DAs around the state. I called and I tell my wife, and Kay is a Nashville girl. She said, you are out of your mind. What have you done? She said, that is the premium prosecutor's office in the state. You'll get worlds of trial, but nobody knows about you up there in the Attorney General's office. Get down there. So I called Tom. I said, Tom, can I come back and talk to you about it? He said, oh, what about? So I went down there and he hired me. So he put me in the trial courts.
And what was it like when you were at the DA's office? What was it like working with Tom Shriver?
Shriver, first and foremost, was a gentleman. I think he was very young when he was elected as district attorney. His father was a judge. Shriver was extremely smart. I think he'd been in the legislature. He's running an office, handling cases himself. He basically, with rare exception, he kind of let us do what we wanted to do, report back to him, because couldn't supervise all of us. He was a gentleman, absolutely first-class person. I remember, of all the things I remember from Tom, my father died prematurely when he was only 60 years old. And I went to Virginia to be with my family, and I came back. And Shriver comes into my office and said, "Raybin, you wear vests." Back then it was popular to wear vests. I said, "Yeah." "You have no watch in your vest and no watch chain." "Yes, we can't have that. You come with me." So we went down to Lower Broad, where there were pawn shops back then. There was some country music places, but not like it is. Back then it was mostly pawn shops. So we walked around Lower Broad. "I need to get you a watch." So we walked all around, and he taught me about pocket watches. And I bought a pocket watch. Well, and I still have that watch today that I bought, and I put it in I had a watch chain and everything, and I really liked it. I wasn't there to buy a watch with Tom Shriver. I was there so I could talk about my dad with him, because his father was a judge. I think Judge Shriver was still alive at the time. That's what that was all about, to make me feel better, to talk about my dad and everything. Now, what kind of person does that? That is a person who cares, a person who wants to work with other people. And we became friends. We were friends. But when he did that with his watch, and he and I was just astounding thing that I had with him. And he later became the judge, just absolute first-class person.
And you still have the pocket watch?
I still have a pocket watch.
When did you go to the DA's office in Davidson County?
In 1978, I went from state AG's office directly to the DA's office. Was assigned to Criminal Court, Division 2. Roger May was the senior assistant. There was just two of us. Judge John Draper, who was, I think by then in his 80s, he was the trial judge. And Roger and I tried cases for years until he went to the U.S. Attorney's office. Then I became the senior person.
And what was that transition like, going from appellate work to suddenly trial boot camp?
This wasn't boot camp. This was you were in war.
Yeah.
I was in a jury trial 3 days after I got there. And of course, I'm asking Roger what to do. Of course, I knew all about jury trials, but I'd only read about them. I'd never actually had ever seen a jury, I don't think. And so here I am arguing, prosecuting a murder case or something in front of a jury. Just a completely different dynamic. You're dealing with jurors. You're trying to convince them that this person sitting over here that they're looking at is guilty of some crime. What a thing to do. It's very difficult. And appeals are slow, intentionally slow. Trials are like war, and things change every minute. That case changes on a dime with a word or a question or something.
After doing jury trials, did your opinion of appeals change when you're looking back at the trial record and determining, what happened?
Of course. It made a big difference actually trying cases, because then I knew, well, why did the lawyer do this and why did the lawyer do that? It changed my dynamic of doing appeals, where I said, it gives you a different perspective doing jury trials. And Roger and I tried cases every week.
And tell me about how, because this system now seems really foreign when you look at it in 2024, but the system of how you and Roger tried cases.
It was just two of us. There was no depth. It was just the two of us. And we would start the case. We'd have 3 or 4 jury trials set that same day. And we'd pick one. We'd plead some guys out, and then we'd have a jury trial. And Roger would pick the jury. I would go back into the witness room and question the witnesses and find out what the case was all about. I didn't even know.
While the jury's being selected. Roger said, "What is this?" I said,
"Armed robbery." "Okay." And then I come out and I make the opening statement because I was the only one that knew anything. And then I'd put the state's witnesses on one right after another. Then by the time we got to the defense Roger figured out what was going on, and he would cross-examine all the defense witnesses. Then I'd make the state's first closing argument. Roger do cleanup, and that's how we tried cases for 5 years like that, literally by the seat of our pants. I mean, there was no technology. We had blackboards and stuff like this.
And it was on the fly. You were meeting witnesses for the first time in the court.
Yes. I mean, if there was an extraordinarily serious case like the Lyford case, which we'll talk about later, of course, I had time to interview witnesses and build a case where it was a complicated case. But so you run-of-the-mill burglary, robbery, murders, and stuff like this, they were absolutely by the seat of your pants because we didn't have any choice. There was no depth. They had two other divisions, and the other lawyers and the other thing, they were doing exactly the same thing we were, trying these things by the seat of the pants. There were no rules. It was just sort of organized chaos.
Speaking of no rules, it's something that, and I think maybe it was earlier than this, but there were no rules of criminal procedure when you first started practicing, and then you helped draft those.
I did. Justice Henry said, we cannot have this. We've got rules of evidence, we have rules of civil procedure, but there are no criminal rules. I mean, it was really chaos. And so he formed this commission. I was the Attorney General's designee. Bill Russell chaired it. Joe Henry was there. And he decreed what rules we would create and change, and we patterned it after the federal rules. I worked on that for years, and that became the Tennessee Rules of Criminal Procedure. After that was over, then the Supreme Court appointed me to chair the commission. I think it was like for 2 terms, 6 years or something. But those rules were created. So I'm here working with the legislature on statutes, and then I'm over here working on the criminal rules while these things are all going on. And that was an enormously helpful experience to deal with not 4 or 5 people, but maybe we had a dozen lawyers and judges who were on the Criminal Rules Commission, prosecutors, defense attorneys, people who became lifelong friends. To fashion these rules out of nothing was just incredible experience to do that and to debate whether the rules should be this way, should be that way, getting tremendous insight. When I'm in court, I know what that rule says. I wrote some of them or fought against them later on. This was a case where Dr. Rose Horn-Lyford is a physician at Mary Hospital. Her husband was, I think, a pharmacy student. And for various reasons, she said she'd been abused or whatever, but she decides she wants to do away with it. So she goes to the other doctors at Meharry and said, do you know any hitmen? And
Not a question you get every day as a physician.
and someone thought she was gay. And so finally, she finds 2 guys that are going to kill her husband. So he comes home one day, and they're hiding behind the door. She's there, and they beat him with baseball bats. And they put him in the back of his sports car. Go to Atlanta. She's following in her car. They're going to park it near Morehouse College where he went and make it look like a drug deal gone bad. Well, one thing about Rose Lyford, she's tighter than bark on a tree, and they didn't put enough gas in the car. So the car runs out of gas, and they end up pulling the car behind a little gas station. It's in the middle of the winter. The body froze, and the people in the gas station had discovered it. She comes back to Nashville, and she's afraid Bobby's not dead, because they beat him, and they thought he was dead. But it may be that he wasn't dead, and he's haunting her. And so she and her secretary conduct an exorcism, a seance, or whatever you want to call it, with candles and all this stuff, praying that Bobby, because he hasn't surfaced, maybe he's out there haunting her as far as she knows. So she tells her secretary what's happened, and they have this exorcism to do away. And meanwhile, his family's going crazy. They have to report him. They said, well, spring comes. Body thaws out, and they find Bobby. And so what happened was that Rose, being the type person that she is, hadn't paid the first killers enough money, and they wanted more. So she hires 2 other guys to kill the first 2. And then we capture them, and they tell us about this other thing, and then the whole thing unravels, and we try her for first-degree murder.
And you're at the prosecutor's office.
As prosecutor, right. And we investigate the heck out of that. Cheryl Blackburn was my co-counsel, and she got involved in the case because originally Rose was going to have an insanity defense. Properly so, I suppose. And so I wanted Cheryl to help me. Cheryl's a judge now, a wonderful person. So Cheryl and I tried this case for almost 2 weeks. And I put on witness after witness about how Rose did this, and we had to get Bobby's body exhumed so we could get his blood type because we found out where the murder occurred. And so the police went to the house, and we went between the boards on the floor to find the blood, his blood, because we didn't know where the murder had happened. And so I put all these witnesses on about hiring, can you know a hitman or whatever. And then I put the secretary on last. It was devastating. And then she argues Mike Engel defended her, did a fantastic job.
Did she ever take the stand?
No, she did not testify. So Mike Engel does a fabulous job, an absolute clear-cut case of first-degree murder. And what I argued to the jury is that you may be sympathetic toward her motive, and I think she was abused. But she made murderers out of these other 2 guys. And that was really what the greatest sin was. She involved other people to kill this man, who I was prosecuting as well. Mike did an incredible job and sort of foreshadowed the battered woman thing, or what do you call it, that the jury convicted her of second-degree murder and gave her a lesser sentence of 10 or 15 years, which was an incredible result. We were happy to get any kind of conviction. Such a weird case.
And I'm glad that she won a second Academy Award.
Obviously, nothing's going to bring back your son, but the appeal justice has been served.
I feel that, well, I'm satisfied.
The prosecution was also pleased with the verdict, but admitted the defense's argument that Dr. Leiphart's actions were prompted by her husband's repeated physical abuse of her led to a lighter sentence.
They did have compassion for the defendant. Everybody would have to have compassion for her. And obviously that was reflected in the sentence. And I think there was 2 decisions to make. One was the degree of guilt, which was murder, and then the degree of culpability, which was reflected in the 15-year sentence.
Leiphart was charged with taking out a $10,000 contract to have her husband murdered. Bobby Leiphart was a Meharry dental student, and according to police, 2 men killed him on January 8, 1981, stuffed his body into the trunk of his car, and abandoned it in Georgia. It was found 2 months later. The 2 men charged with the actual killing have not yet stood trial for murder.
10 or 15 years she's in prison, and then you actually meet up again with Dr. Leiphart. Tell us about that.
Fast forward 30 years. She goes to prison. She gets her medical license back. I'm shocked. I'm now in private practice as a defense attorney. Secretary said, there's a woman here who wants to see you about a pardon. Ben and I do pardons. Who is it? Her name is Rose Leiphart. I was shocked. I said, I got to see this. I got in the room, and there she stands. And she said, Mr. Raybin, I need a pardon. I do understand you need pardons. I want you to get a pardon for it.
And did she know that you were the prosecutor?
Of course. And that's why she came to me. She said, you're the perfect person. Because, of course, she remembered who I was and sat there in the courtroom together for weeks. And she knew I had done all these pardon work and stuff. And so she comes to me to get this pardon. And I took a picture just to send to Cheryl. I said, I can't do this pardon. I put you in prison. I can't very well get a pardon to get you out, as it were. Really an enormous conflict of interest, which she understood. But that's part of what we talk about is this symmetry in the world and law, and in my experience. I do one thing today, and then 20 years later, 30 years later, something comes along that relates back to this event 20 or 30 years later.
A little Girl Scout goes missing, and then eventually her body is found in the 70s. What was your involvement in that case?
I was in the district attorney's office when this happened, and there was a long investigation. And the district attorney and the police primarily thought that a young boy who lived in the neighborhood, Jeffrey Womack, had killed Marcia Trimble. This was an incredible homicide. The city was upset, to say the least. A little girl selling Girl Scout cookies, murdered blocks from her home. They arrest Womack for murder. And the assistant district attorney who was assigned the case comes to me and asks me if I will assist him in trying this case, which is the biggest case in the city, without a doubt. And I was to deal with all the legal issues. There was tons of legal issues. His defense attorney was John Hollins, Sr., we'll get to later, and Ed Yarbrough. And the lawyer the assistant gives me the file to look at so I can figure out how to best proceed. And I look at the file and I come to the realization, there's no case here. And I tell the lawyer, the assistant, I'm not going to participate in this. And so, I mean, what a fabulous opportunity is to prosecute this case. And I turn it down because there's no evidence there. I look at the file, I went to Shriver and said, this is wrong. I am not going to be a part of this. I mean, I didn't say I'll quit if I have to. I wouldn't go that far, but he said, what's wrong with this? And I said, well, fast forward a few months, there's motions and things, and finally Ed Yarbrough goes spelunking with Tom Shriver in both cavers. And they dismiss the case against Jeffrey Womack. Well, the police are outraged. But they're just not enough evidence. That wasn't because of what I did. There was a great lawyer like Carter Hollins and Yarbrough and stuff. But the case is not prosecuted. They dismiss. Fast forward, I guess 30 years. And terribly more. Well, more than that, I guess.
Around, I think 2007, 2008.
Right.
Jerome Barrett is arrested.
Right.
It's all over the news. The Marcia Trimble case has finally been solved.
Well, what happened was the police kept investigating the case. Now, they had DNA. We didn't have DNA back then. So they had the DNA in the database, and they periodically run these old cases. And they got a hit that Jerome Barrett, who'd been convicted and arrested for some other homicide, a rape and homicide, not that far from where Trimble was killed, there's a match between his DNA and the DNA found at the scene.
And at this point, John Hollins Sr. is your partner, your law partner.
He had hired me to be in his office. It's a whole nother story. Ed Yarbrough is now the U.S. attorney. I remember this like it was yesterday. Hollins is in his office. The secretary said, the U.S. attorney's on the phone for you. Hollins' office was next to me. And Ed Yarbrough tells John Hollins that DNA has just been developed and that Jerome Barrett is now conclusively the suspect. And that, of course, Jeffrey Womack could not be. Hollins, for the first time in his life, is utterly speechless. John Hollins is another larger-than-life person. And he is utterly speechless. He turns absolutely pale, and this thing comes over him because for 30 years he had fought for this kid and had believed in his innocence. And he was vindicated with one phone call from his other partner, who was partner, Ed Yarbrough. So I got to see the case at the beginning where I believed that there was no case. So Womack could not have done this. And now I'm here 30 years later where the phone call comes in and I actually see and live through this lawyer's vindication of his client, who he had fought for with no fee or whatever, because he believed in this kid's innocence. And I saw Hollins' reaction to this. And it was another out-of-body experience for me to see somebody who I admired and thought the most of John Hollins, as just absolutely tenacious lawyer, to be absolutely turned into a wisp of air, as it were, by this news. And he realized 30 years had gone past him and he had seen all of it. That was an incredible experience to see John that way. And I had this wave of emotion because I had the empathy for him because I had had this experience before. So they convicted him. Jeffrey and John wrote a book about all of this, and they had book signings and all of that. So that was another instance where something I had done years ago. And John Hollins always had a statement. He said, David, it's great for the cases that you take, but some of the smartest decisions you'll make are cases that you don't take. That you have enough sense not to take something. You'll never regret a case you didn't take. And he was right about that, although I didn't see it quite that way that many years before. I got to be involved in some things that were new, different approaches. We had a horrible case in Nashville of numbers of women who were being raped by one or two people. These women were at Fisk, they were Tennessee State, and they were primarily women of color, Hispanic people, black ladies, and the assailant would prey on them, thinking they would never come forward. And it was terrible because there was an accusation that the police and the government were not doing anything about it because of the race of the victim, and which was not the case at all. And so the chief of police, Joe Casey, and Tom Shriver said, we're going to form a team, and we're going to get this guy, and we're going to figure this out. So we formed a team. I was the prosecutor. Diane Vaughn, superb detective, was a detective, and Carol Etherington, who was a nurse, sort of a victim's advocate kind of person, because we had to deal with these women who were just absolutely traumatized, and they wouldn't even want to testify. This was terrible. So we put this team together. I remember we had search warrants, we're running around, and it occurs to us that this is the same guy who's doing this. He's a serial rapist. We didn't know there was such a thing. The dynamics of that were new to us from a prosecution and police standpoint. I mean, you say to yourself today, well, how stupid can you be? It had to start somewhere. And by having an interdisciplinary approach to this, we were able to address the issue, get the women to be able to testify, investigate the case properly, make sure the search warrants were legal, and then present the case to a jury. And Carol was absolutely vital to the case. She later started the police program, helped police officers who were traumatized. She started the victim witness program in Nashville. But how that got started was she would go with us and talk to the victims and help us understand the psychology of all of this from a victim standpoint. So we were successful in apprehending this person. We were successful in prosecuting him and convicting him. And the things that we learned, we explained to other prosecutors in other parts of the city and the state to put these teams together. And of course, today, that's just routine, that you have groups of prosecutors who are dedicated to specific kinds of things. But this was Joe Casey and Tom Shriver responding to what the public thought was wrong. And we responded to it, came up with a good solution with the interdisciplinary approach. And I'm proud of the work we did then.
And that gets us to sort of you meeting John Hollins Jr., or John Hollins Sr., rather, as when you're a prosecutor. And then he ends up offering you a job. How did that come about?
Thank you for asking that question, because that's just the basic thing that also happens to me in my life as an attorney. I get asked I got a job offer from the Attorney General's office, and I got a job offer from John Hollins. At the time, I had left the district attorney's office the year before to write my book on criminal defense. I wrote a book on criminal law that lawyers and judges use. And it was so much time and so much effort. And I'd been with the prosecutor's office for 10 years. And I said, I need to do something else. Amy, that was probably one of the happiest times of my life. That Kay and I had Jaime, our daughter. Ben was on the way. I had no income except from the small advance from West Publishing Company, and I'm writing this book. And I finished the book, and as I'm finishing the book, I get this call from John Hollins. And it's just typical John Hollins. David, what are you doing? I'm finishing my book. Great. I'll see you in my office at 10 o'clock in the morning. Click. That was it. So I turned to Kay, who's standing right there, and she could hear him yelling in the phone. And she said, well, I don't have to tell you what to do I? I said, no, dear, you don't. Because I'd already
You did make the same mistake with Tom Shriver.
Absolutely. I was about to turn down John Hollins to put me in a job in his office. I mean, he was a premier litigator in the city. Well, the state, really. I mean, that was a no-brainer, as it were. But it was funny when I looked at her, and she said, well, you know what you're going to do. Yeah, I'm going to go see John in the morning. So I did, and he hired me to be an associate at his firm. One of the assistants had left. So I got to be in John's office. And Amy, that was practicing law in the Grand Manor. It was John Hollins, Ed Yarborough, John Waxter, and then some other attorneys joined us. And we would sit around, but we'd litigate cases all day. Then we'd meet in John's office at the end of the day, and we'd each have to go around and tell what we did. And then John would finish. His stories were always more wonderful and fantastic than anybody else's. And he'd be drinking his toddies. And it was practicing law in the Grand Manor. I didn't have to say what. He had certain rules in the office. Always, return your phone calls, always do this and that. But he was a really, really, really wonderful lawyer. It was a great experience. And of course, he had been influenced tremendously by the premier criminal defense attorney in Nashville, Jack Norman. Jack Norman was, without a doubt, the best criminal lawyer that ever walked the streets of Nashville. I mean, just absolutely fantastic attorney. Just really, really, really good lawyer. He had all these tricks. Norman, you know why DUIs are 48 hours instead of 2 days?
Now let's think about that.
Norman had a Bill Meets socialite who got sentenced to 2 days. So he brings her into the jail in Faye Thomas's office at 11:30 at night. That's one day. She smokes 2 cigarettes. It's now 12:30 the next day. Smoked 2 more cigarettes. Faye said, well, that's 2 days. See you later. So out she goes, and she'd been in custody all of 2 hours. Well, it was pandemonium. Jack pulled us off. So they changed the law, then it was 2 days instead of 48 hours instead of 2 days. But those are the kind of things that Norman would do. And Norman was a premier lawyer, and Hollins was a student of Jack Norman, how to try lawsuits, a bull in the china shop kind of way. And then Norman wrote this fabulous letter to John Hollins, which I still have, where he gives this advice to John Hollins about how to be a lawyer. Now, Norman is now in his 90s, and he's retired. And Hollins, he writes this letter to John. John had done something fabulous. And he wrote this letter to Hollins about how to be a lawyer. And I read this when I got the Norman Award to the Assembled Peaks. I didn't know what else to read, so I read this letter. He said, trial work calls for hard work, careful preparation, succinct presentation, and strict allegiance to the claims of the lawyer's client. You've got to be a gentleman in the courtroom and deferential to your adversaries. There's no other profession that can give you more satisfaction than the opportunity to be a trial lawyer. I loved every day of my 60 years in that courtrooms. As a matter of fact, I have now approached 9 years of age. I give anything I have to get up tomorrow and try the toughest case in the courthouse. So this is Norman's advice to John Hollins, which is fabulous advice to any lawyer.
And what was that like going, from the prosecutor side? You've been at the AG's office, prosecutor, and now all of a sudden you're in private practice as a defense attorney.
Well, first of all, I had that year off to finish writing my law book, which I guess we'll read the dedication later on. But so I had that time to get that mental shift. But it was really and I get this question all the time, it makes shifty. It was no different. I still had to be aggressive. I still had to know my stuff. I didn't have 10,000 cases at once, as I did in a prosecutor, although that really helped me learn how to assimilate a case very, very quickly. That's what the DA's office does for you in the other respects. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with being in private practice, you have to quote fees, you have the business side of the law, which you don't have. But fortunately, I've always had good partners who dealt with the business side, so I never had to write checks. I don't know about any of that stuff. But it was not difficult at all to make the so-called transition because you're still at war and you're still doing the same thing.
So we all know of the awards that you've won as a lawyer and the respect and reputation you have among the bar. I want to talk a little bit about how you built up your reputation in other communities, like the one where we met. The media. You talk about how you've always embraced the media, and you were always. One thing I appreciated is I could call you at 8 at night, and you would say, "Come on over to the house. I'll do an interview." Why?
Because I think it's important that the press get a story out and that I have a participation in it, just like legislation and everything. But the truth is, it's vanity. I absolutely love being on TV. I like being on television and stuff and giving my point of view. I think it's great for publicity standpoint. Our publicity budget in my office is zero. It's better than on TV and stuff. I mean, that's truthfully what it is. I like it. I enjoy talking about the cases, giving opinions. It also raises my visibility, and I get clients this way. The lawyers have them, and civilians see me. I mean, I go to the grocery store with Kate. So I saw you on TV, and that sort of thing. So I really enjoy doing that, and I appreciate good reporters like you asking me these questions. And so, yeah, I want to be available. Sometimes I have no clue of what I'm going to talk about. I make it up as I go along. Or I call another lawyer who knows what the thing is about, and I find out what the facts are and what the law is, and I'll repeat what some lawyers said, and I sound like I know what I'm talking about.
And, when a criminal defense client walks in the door, what's sort of your approach? What do you do first?
My approach is now different than it was at the beginning, and this is what I got from my wife. I would interview the client, find out what the story was. And so I've always found that no matter how long you talk to a client, you don't get everything. And I had one client, Jimmy Simmons, who was a bus driver. And he was a diabetic, had a diabetic episode, and as a bus driver, he ran over a Volkswagen, killed 2 kids. And he was the most inarticulate person, and I couldn't get anything out of it. So I said, "Okay, what am I going to do?" He said, "Can he write?" I said, "Yes, dear, he can write." "Well, have him write out the story of his life and tell him about all this." Fine. So next day he comes in, I've had this piece of paper. "Dear Mr. Raybin, this thing with the bus was the second most traumatic thing that ever happened to me." He used the word traumatic, but that was the point. Well, I read the next line. "When I was in Vietnam, I was a medic on a helicopter, and it was shot down, and I ran across the rice paddies with my machine gun, and I saved the captain. I got an award." He's like Forrest Gump. Well, he was a war hero. I had no idea. And so we go to court, and I put this war hero thing on. And then I said, there's got to be more to this. And one of the people on the bus, this was around Christmas time, had a long white beard. And he played Santa Claus at the mall. And he was a witness. So I put him on to testify. I turned to the prosecutor and said, "You want to cross-examine Mr. Kringle?" There's no way. I want to cross-examine Santa Claus. And the judge put him on probation after he made it serve like 90 days or something like this, and then double homicide. So what I learned from Kay's advice, great advice, was to get the client to write out the story. And that's what I do in every case, because you always learn something more.
And you still do that today?
Yeah.
You still do that today?
I still do that today. Well, why do I need to write this out? Because I always learn something more about the client, because they're in the office, they're intimidated, the lawyer, they don't know what to say. but in the quiet and peacefulness of their own home, they can kind of write out their thoughts. It's cathartic, it helps, and it gives me nuggets of information I never would have otherwise. And that is probably the premier thing that I do, involving myself with the client and learn their story. The greatest failure that you can have as a lawyer is not getting with your client.
Tell me about the very first case you were appointed to as a criminal defense attorney.
I am in private practice, John Holland's office. It's very expensive to run a law firm. You want to get clients to pay you fees and stuff. And I get appointed to a case. Judge Randall Wyatt, who I had prosecuted cases in front of after Judge Shriver retired for many years. And Randall Wyatt, just absolutely fantastic judge, calls me on the phone and said, "David, I have a theft case. I need to appoint you on a theft case. Be in court in the morning." "Yes, sir." So I called the clerk. I said, "What case is there that I'm going to get appointed to?" "Well, it's C.H. Butcher." And of course, I go to court the next day. There are cameras everywhere. I'm loving this, and there's my client, C.H. Butcher, and his brother, Jake, ran a bank in East Tennessee. His brother was running for governor. And the bank failed, and they defrauded hundreds of people out of millions of dollars. But C.H. is now arrested for violating laws in East Tennessee federal court and in Nashville. I'm now appointed to represent C.H. Butcher.
And you've been on the job for a week.
A week.
The man who stands in the ruins of what was a huge financial empire said today he will fight prosecutors to the end. C.H. Butcher Jr. pleaded not guilty to charges he lied to state officials about the financial condition of his company, the Southern Industrial Banking Corporation. Valerie Hyman has a report.
He's already a familiar face in some courtrooms across the state, but C.H. Butcher Jr. made his first appearance today in criminal court in Nashville. Judge Randall Wyatt appointed an attorney to represent Butcher because he claims to be bankrupt and unable to afford his own lawyer. So on behalf of his brand new client, Nashville criminal lawyer and former assistant district attorney David Raybin told the judge, C.H. Butcher Jr. pleads not guilty to all the charges against him.
I go in there and I get to meet him. The cameras are everywhere. And he's charged with bank fraud times 10. And in looking at, years and years and years in prison. And so I'm a co-counsel is Bobby Lee Cook, fantastic lawyer from Georgia. So here's this $500,000 lawyer defending Bob C.H. And here I am, a $500 lawyer, appointed attorney. And we're fighting with Bobby Lee Cook over what to do in the case. Finally, we have a meeting in Chattanooga. Tory Johnson's a district attorney, and we're supposed to go to Chattanooga. Then I had to get permission from the judge for mileage. I couldn't go on my own. I had to ask the judge, can I have mileage? So I go to the court, file a motion for mileage. And he said, who's going to Chattanooga? I said, Tory Johnson. Your motion for mileage, Mr. Raybin, is denied. What? You will ride with Tory Johnson to Chattanooga and back. And somewhere over the lookout, man, on the way back, we settled kicks. Because Wyatt was smart enough to figure if he put the prosecutor and defense lawyer in the same car for 4 hours, they got nothing else to do but settle the case, and so we did.
Sentenced Butcher to 5 years in state prison. The sentence part of a plea bargain worked out this month. Under it, the ex-banker also faces up to 25 years in federal prison for bankruptcy fraud.
Mr. Butcher regrets the actions that occurred.
Butcher's court-appointed lawyer says his client will serve about 8 months in the Hamilton County Workhouse because of credit for pretrial detention confinement. Then Butcher goes to federal prison.
We talked about trying cases. How do you try a case? What is it that you try to come up with? And of course, you try to counter the state's evidence as best you can to disassemble it. But sometimes you have to have a novel approach. And I talked about mental health issues and that kind of thing. And one case I had, which I just couldn't figure out. The client was on drugs a lot. But in this particular instance, he didn't have any drugs, but he still committed pretty serious offense. So figuring out, well, he wasn't intoxicated. What's happened here? I called my brother-in-law, Bob Kutcher, who's a physician in Atlanta. Wonderful doctor. His wife was a case sister. She's an attorney. And I explained to Bob what was going on here. And this guy didn't have any drugs. What can I do? So Bob says, I'll tell you what. Why don't you come out with a drug holiday defense? I said, well, I've heard of Doc Holiday, but I've never heard of a drug holiday. What are you talking about? He said, well, sometimes doctors will wean their clients off of medication for a period of time. It's called a drug holiday. And you have to be careful because it might have an adverse reaction, just like you remove a drug from somebody for a period of time. It can have unknown and catastrophic consequences. It's known as a drug holiday. So I said, I uttered some profanities, and I said, you kidding? There is such a, he said, oh yeah. So I ran with that, the drug holiday, and it worked. It just sounded the most preposterous thing you'd ever heard of. But I got his doctor in and prescribed all this medication, and I said, well, we talk about the drug holiday. And he said, yeah, it could have adverse consequences, and he might do wacky things. It was so confusing. It wasn't that serious a crime. I can't remember even what it was. But, you ask your friends and relatives about these things. Bob came up with the drug holiday. I asked Kay about an insanity case that I was working on. And she said, oh, yeah, insanity, it comes and goes. It's cyclic. It's cyclic insanity. I said, well, that's crazy, no pun intended. So I tried to sell that to the Supreme Court, and I did. And now you can find an opinion in the Supreme Court of Tennessee where they talk about cyclic insanity.
I know this wasn't when you were at the Attorney General's office, but you showed me a great picture where you're waving a blank piece of paper in front of the Court of Criminal Appeals. Can you tell me about that?
Oh, yes. That particular case involved a Miranda waiver, whether my client had waived her Miranda rights or not. And that was the case was all about. So I pick up this piece of paper and I said, Your Honor, here is my client's Miranda waiver. And they're all looking at it. And they said, Mr. Raybin, you've got the wrong piece of paper. There's nothing on it. It's completely blank. I said, exactly. There was no Miranda waiver. Wow. That made it big. It was a demonstrative exhibit in the appellate court, which is really rare. But it made the point. It was devastating to the other side because that illustrated precisely what I was trying to say.
And you mentioned battered women's syndrome. How did that become sort of a part of your career and policy that you created?
Well, I didn't create it exactly. I litigated the first battered woman case in Tennessee. And of course, we'll get into the Lyford case later, I guess, when I was a prosecutor. But this battered women thing, a young woman was convicted of killing her husband, and the lawyers who represented her did not put on the psychological impacts of why she did this. This was self-defense in a way because he had battered her multiple times. Most of my witnesses at the trial were police officers who had been there before. But getting ahead of myself, he didn't put on any of this battered women stuff. So I had a motion. She was convicted of murder. She was in prison. And so I put on in the motion for new trial evidence of what the lawyers should have put on, that I call psychologists and people, to demonstrate that a woman or a spouse is hypervigilant when they're being battered. They don't know when the next battering is going to come. And then you'll always want to know that there's some issue. Why did the person kill their spouse at that moment? It's usually because of the child or they can't take it anymore. And so I appealed the case and won. I appealed on one issue and one issue alone, which I can't believe I did. And they said the lawyer was ineffective for not putting this on it. They recognized the battered woman syndrome as a species of evidence in Tennessee, perhaps lessen the offense from murder to manslaughter. And it was used all across the state, all across the country. In other states, they had it. We retried the case. I put that evidence on. A jury convicted her of criminally negligent homicide. She put a knife between his shoulder blades. And the judge put her on probation. So this was an instance where battered women case defense laid precedent in Tennessee. And so I spoke about it all over the state, and other lawyers use it all the time now. But that's an instance, Amy, where an appellate case affected one person, but it had an effect across the state forevermore. And of course, that's one of the seminal Tennessee cases on battered women. That kind of evidence is now admissible in Tennessee.
The Lawrence McKinney case, and that's one that I know you're proud of.
I am so proud of that case. Lawrence McKinney was convicted in Memphis. And the victim, there was no racial thing. The victim was black. McKinney was black. I mean, it was another person. He was convicted of rape 40 years ago now, but he spent 30 years in prison. Well, DNA comes along. And some really good lawyers in Memphis get him a new trial because DNA showed conclusively he could not have been one of the rapists. It wasn't possible. The DNA was from the other culprit and some third person. So the case gets dismissed, and Lawrence McKinney comes to Jack Lowry, who just absolutely world-class lawyer of Lebanon. And Lowry calls me and said, Raybin, he wants to get a pardon from the governor, and he wants to get an exoneration that he's innocent. And if we can pull it off, we'll go to the board of claims and get $1 million for this guy for wrongful imprisonment. Just sign me up. So we worked the case, go for the parole board, which you're required to do first. And we put on a fantastic case that McKinney could not be guilty. Well, the parole board said, well, you know, DNA, we get it, but we're not going to exonerate your client. There's still some lingering questions here. It goes to the governor. The governor said, no, parole board hasn't recommended it. Too bad. Okay. That's just wrong. Lowry is furious. I'm furious. So we figure we'll wait a few years till there's another governor. New people on the parole board. 10 years goes by. We're back in front of the parole board. We put on the case that's 100 times better. Parole board proceeds to recommend the exoneration. Lowry is now purple. I'm gone crazy with this. This is the greatest injustice. We go to the governor. Then we find some legislators. Never me being in a legislature, being these people, we know them. Then we go to the churches. And the churches, where this guy works in a church, his pastor gets all the other pastors together, and they have this theme where McKinney's in church praying, and it's all over the TV and stuff. This is the greatest injustice in the world. And the ministers descend on the legislature, the governor. One day I get a phone call from the governor's legal counsel. Mr. Raybin, come up here in the morning on the McKinny case. Yes, sir. Well, I know what that was. Jack and I go up there. There's the McKinney's pardon and exoneration. What does Jack Lowry do? We want to have a press conference. He loves the press more than I do. So we have this press conference, and there's pictures of us there. And then we go to the board of claims. We get him $1 million. That was a case that took us 10 years of work because we believed in this guy. He believed in us. And it wasn't, for us, it wasn't the money anymore at that point, although we got a nice fee out of it. It's to help him live the rest of his life with some money. That was a case where tenacity, we just fought like tigers for that forever to help that guy. So I'm really proud of that case, sure.
What about the foster care lawsuit?
And yeah, I told you that if there's a thing that they put on lawyers' graves, aside from how long you lived with good parents, I would want to have represented the foster kids in Tennessee. Put that on my gravestone. This was a case where the foster care system in Tennessee was in chaos. Little foster kids who had no one were getting shuttled from home to home. Some of them were sleeping in athases and stuff. They were terrible sight. No one is more helpless than a 6-year-old who has no father or mother who's been shuttled around in the foster care system. So New York Public Interest Firm comes to Tennessee and looking for local counsel. And because I had all these connections with the legislature and the attorney general and all this stuff, from years before, they come and interview me. And then I get my partner at the time, Jackie Dixon, who's an excellent attorney. And we become local counsel for children's rights in New York. And we fought like tigers in that case, and finally we brought them to the table. And they said, Raybin, we're going to beat you. I said, how are you going to beat us? Well, we've got 6 lawyers assigned to this case. So really? Yep. Okay. And we'll take depositions everywhere. So I said, fine. So I called my friends up all across the state. I said, guess what? What? You're now a lawyer for the foster kids. Okay. So they put 6 lawyers on it. I had 20. All volunteers from every part of the state who I just call up on the phone and said, I need help with this foster. You need to do a deposition in Memphis. You need to do one. And we outgunned it. We outmanned them. We destroyed them. And they came to the table, and there was a consent decree helping the foster kids and putting it under a federal court order to help all these little kids. What a wonderful thing. It wasn't just me, but I was a part of it. It's a Brian A. case. And I sat there in the middle and trying to figure out ways to help these helpless little kids because they had no lawyers. They had no representation. They had no voice. And so to find people who are the most helpless, stand up there and use all of your legal skills that you acquired for all these years to fight the good fight, to help these little kids. God, I'm proud of, I was part of that and did that. Of course, consent decree eventually disappeared, and now the foster care system is in a mess, but that's for someone else to deal with. But they can use the precedent we did. But that's another case where it was 10 years of work to get that done. God, I'm proud of what we did in that case to help those people.
Well, we talked about you starting to try cases at the DA's office, and you and Roger May and the system that you had. The technology that was available to you was a chalk and a blackboard.
Right.
How have things changed, 40 years later, 50 years later?
Well, there's several things. Of course, a trial is still a hearing. It's still very auditory. That's why we call them hearings. But the technology was just chalks and blackboards. That's all it was. And we had photographs. We'd wave pictures around in the gun. I'd love to wave the gun around. But then slowly but surely technology changed. And of course, the first thing was DNA, biological evidence. And the next thing has changed is videos, the internet, as it were. And so you can't try a case today without some cell phone technology, video cameras. Videos are everywhere. And so we now have changed the way we try cases by having people help us do the technology, because we can't do it all. People in this room, Kristen is here, is there my technology expert. KT helps us putting these videos together, composites videos, and presenting them to the jury. That's important in changing the way you present cases because the jury expects it. They want their instant this and instant that. They've seen Law and Order, and the best thing you can do is your crime scene expert. I put all that kind of stuff and talk about the ballistics, but it's got to be visual. You can't just talk about it. You have to have pictures of bullets ejecting from guns and trajectory and things, and you have to have the video and present all of this. And so trial has always been theater, but now the technology takes over in many respects from the lawyer in the sense that you're producing this stuff or you're directing it, you're showing the jury so they can make up their own mind and they put them back at the scene. And when I talk about Kristen, KT, that's helping us, her idea to help me is put the jury there. Don't tell them what happened. They don't want to hear from you. Put them there. Make the video so that they can see what happened and feel what happened and see the perception of things. And so that's what we're doing now from a technological standpoint. Cell phones, where was the defendant here? Was he somewhere else? We've won cases based exclusively on the technology. That's what prosecutors use. So you have to know about that stuff, but you have to let other people help you. And so while I just had one investigator, I had a fleet of investigators. Now I have technology people helping me put these things together and presenting our case. So that's what's changed. But still, at the end, it's convincing 12 people. And you have different tools to do that. You still have to present your side of things and present a story. It is theater. You want to present a story so that they'll agree with you. So in one sense, it's changed, but in another, it's still the same.
And lawyers are a tough crowd. Media maybe a little tougher. And then you've got people who have been convicted of crimes before, and you have quite the reputation at Riverbend, or maybe it was the old prison that you were telling me about, where your number is etched in the walls.
Well, yes, that was the greatest compliment I've ever received. On the wall in the prison, I think it was the kitchen, it said, "For a good time, see Stevie, prison number 4473. For no time, see David Raybin, 256-6666. So, yeah, that's how we got a reputation of helping prisoners get their sentences reduced.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something else that I know you're proud of, and that's the book that you wrote.
I was in the district attorney's office, and I had a little pamphlet of Supreme Court cases that I relied on to help us. And I had little index cards of cases. And I said, gee, it would be great if I had a little pamphlet of cases. So I contacted West Publishing Company and said, I'd like to consider writing a pamphlet. Oh, no, we don't need a pamphlet. We need a book. What?
Yeah, let's look at that book, because it looks like more than a tough with.
And it was a pamphlet. There's actually 3 volumes before I finished with this thing. And so I started writing this book, and most books on this talk about, criminal procedure and all of this. I had a completely different idea. So I like this from the standpoint of the practitioner. What's the first thing that happens? You meet your client. So the first chapters of the book deal with how you deal with criminal case from the standpoint of a practitioner, not from the traditional legal way that these books are set up. So I started out with the arrest and all of that kind of stuff, and I worked my way all the way through arrests and discovery and the trial procedure and all that sort of thing. So the approach was very different. I had a lot of practical advice in the case, how to do this and how to do that. And so I wrote this book. For years it took me to finish this thing, and I published it. And as we talked about, it eventually, judges used it. Judges cited it. Prisoners fought over it in the penitentiary, threw it at each other. Had to give a copy to the prison because one of them was full of blood and biological stuff, and they were throwing books at each other, but using my book, fighting over it. And it basically, as I said, it sort of put me on the map because judges use it, appellate courts cite it as authority, that sort of thing. Sometimes appellate attorney general will cite my book against me. Don't ever do that. I'll reverse you if you do. And I have, and so they don't cite my book against me.
And I want you to read the dedication, because I think it's really touching and special.
The dedication is to my mother, who taught me how to read books, to my father, who taught me which books were worth reading, and to my wife, daughter, son, whose love and encouragement enabled me to write one. And the reason why I wrote the dedication as I did was when I was a child, I was dyslexic, still dyslexic. I couldn't read. And my mother taught me how to read because the schools were just not working for me. And she taught me how to read. And I can't remember how old I was before I even knew how to read because it was what she taught me. And then my dad, the smartest man I've ever known, said, these are some core books you need to read, and this is what you should look for. And these books may not be what you would look at. These are the core books. So he taught me what books to read, how to approach literature, that sort of thing. And so between the two of them, I got this love of books. And then, of course, when I wrote the second edition of this, I was married then, had children, and so I changed the dedication to include them. But, of course, they're part of this book, too.
Did your mom get a chance to read that dedication?
She did.
What was her reaction?
Oh, she was touched. You know, she said, yeah, I remember we'd sit there on the stoop when the bus would be coming along. And how she would teach me how to read. She said, yeah, I remember that. Thanks for writing that. And what she said about your dad is true. But, yeah, it meant a lot to her. It means a lot to me.
One thing I wanted to touch on was, I know you have a love of teaching, and you got an opportunity, sort of teaching of a lifetime in Russia. Tell me about that.
This was a wonderful opportunity, about 95 or so. And the Russians got rid of the communists. They put in a new democracy, not very democratic now, but at that time. And they put back jury trials, which they had in the days of the Tsar. And there was one problem with that. There was nobody left to know how to try a jury case. So American foundations put together teams of lawyers who would go to Russia. And I was on one team to teach the Russians how to try jury trials. Steve Rush headed this up, asked me who the other lawyers could be. I said, I'm going to be one of them. And so I helped pick some of these fantastic lawyers from the United States who had great teaching abilities. Nancy Hollander. So we went to Moscow. And we had hands-on teaching for 2 weeks. The lawyers, Russian lawyers, many of whom spoke pretty good English. We had translators. And we would do, here's how you do an opening statement. Go ahead and do the opening statement. Here's how you cross-examine witnesses and stuff. And so we found that the system over there is very similar to ours. But I did find that the difference was in the quality of the judges here, 100 times better. And I'm sure they have dedicated judges over there, but the judges here are far superior than the judges that I saw in Russia. The lawyers are very aggressive. The prosecutors are very aggressive. And the dynamics is different. I mean, took a jury in Russia, remember, watched the jury trial. It took them 3 days to elect a foreman because they didn't have a democratic understanding of how to do that. So there were some differences. That was a wonderful experience, getting to see another culture, teaching people how to try cases the American way, I suppose, and having that international experience of running around Red Square, drinking lots of vodka, getting to know some really good people that I've known since then. So that was just a wonderful opportunity to go to Moscow and have the teaching experience.
And you have 2 wonderful children, Jaime, who's an artist. Tell us a little bit about her.
Jaime is an artist, and that is incredible that she can take a blank piece of paper and create something that out of her head that no one has ever seen before. And I have learned so much from her about her art, her creative skills, and how she approaches things. And I said, well, gee, that's kind of what we do in law. We take a blank slate of a client with a case, we got to paint it and everything. But she's doing this from an art standpoint. She also creates images, she creates movies and that kind of thing. She worked as an admissions director at a local art school. very just incredibly gifted artist, but she's also incredibly empathic. And I said, oh, Jaime, why don't you become a jury consultant and help us pick jurors and stuff? Because you could sit there when she comes to court, she said, oh, this person's got this emotion and that. She's the most empathic person I've ever met. And so having her, to learn from and have that experience. And so what Kay and I want to do with her was to make sure she can potentially have a happy childhood too, like we had, which perhaps is a great gift that we can give her. So she lives here in town. We're blessed that she just lives just a mile or two from where we are. And she works with, for nieces, my granddaughter, on some art things. And so that's just a wonderful thing. I'm so blessed to have Jaime. And she's created some fantastic paintings. She's had shows at the Frisk. She's had shows at the Renaissance Fair. And one of her paintings hangs in my office. And I look at it every day. Well, you ask about some of the hobbies that I have with the photography. And the hobby, so it's a hobby with Kay and dancing. We consider that hobby something we do together. But something that I also do, which is I think an outgrowth of when I was in military school, is collecting and building model tanks and ships. When I was young, we would do that, plastic things. And then later it graduated into model soldiers, lead soldiers about this high. And I would paint them by the hundreds and then by the thousands. And so there's a great hobby out there of people who collect model soldiers. Well, that's fine. They're sitting there, but they're static. They don't do anything. So what we do now is we have war games with them. You've heard of games or Dungeons and Dragons, where people have dragons and stuff and people like that. We like to have historical miniatures. Civil War stuff, World War II, Napoleonic. And we have these vast battles with people who have all sorts of different occupations, but they have one thing in common. They like history. They like to recreate these battles. It's competitive in a sort. It's having fun. And so you have these things on the table and you move them around. And you think, well, maybe if Napoleon had did this, maybe the battle would have ended that way. Well, maybe, but it's sort of like super chess in a way, and you're thinking. And I like that because it's sort of like an outgrowth of litigation. I mean, it's war. Litigation is war. We have war with miniatures and stuff. And I like the miniature hobby because it exposes me to other people who are not in the quote-unquote legal profession. I mean, think about that. We're with lawyers all the time. We want to have some other kind of association with other people, whether it's through your church or synagogue or whatever, other things that you mix out, other friends that you make. So this gives me the opportunity to mix out with other people who have a love of history, who like the wargaming, and we learn from each other. We have a convention every year here in Nashville. Thousands of people from all over the country have these conventions. And we have hundreds of them come here, put on games and space games and naval games and all this sort of thing. And now I have these big pirate ships that I have, and I cut the bottoms off and I move the pirate ships around on the table. And then, of course, we use this tarp that we got from Home Depot, blue tarp. And my daughter, Jaime, said, that looks terrible. Why? Sweetie, what's wrong with it? It doesn't look like the ocean. So I come back 2 days later, and she's turned this beautiful Caribbean water on this blue tarp has now turned into a beautiful Caribbean sea. So I put the ships on it. Everybody wants to buy my ships, but everybody wants to buy the Caribbean Ocean. It ain't for sale. But that's the kind of thing that she just said, that's the way it's going to be. It's beautiful. So that's something that I do. It's a diversion. It's exciting to me. I write articles about it. I get to know other people about it. And it's just another part of me, of things that we do. And we all have to do other things. And again, you've asked me questions about what advice I have for lawyers. Do other things. Do other hobbies. have other interests. Ben said, Dad, Sarah's parents are taking dancing lessons. Sarah and I are taking dancing lessons. Well, I know what that. Dad and I are going to go because we're going to have a wedding over here at the Shimon. We need to go. So we go to dance class and we get Wedding 101. And this was like 10 years ago. And it's wonderful. We go, where else do you get to hold your spouse and twirl around the dance room and listen to music and stuff and learn the same dances over and over, get you forgotten. And it's wonderful. And so then after the wedding, we went to, where was it? Paris, for a tour over there. And they had a New Year's Eve party. Beautiful, beautiful mirrored thing. So we're dancing in France. Well, I knew all these so-called wedding moves, and Kay knew her. So the men were dancing with Kay, and I'm dancing with the women. We had a wonderful time doing that. And so dancing has become a part of our lives. I don't know if it helps me dance around the courtroom or not, but I really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. Kay and I enjoyed our dancing in Paris. Dancing is something we've always had fun with because that's how we met, at a dance here in Nashville. Our first date was at Centennial Park, and I brought along my camera and we started taking pictures of each other. We discovered a lot of things that we shared and enjoy about each other. And it's true that while I was born in a different decade, we discovered we had the same birthday, which we share every year. And we figured this was just a magical, amazing connection. Amy, I was not going to let this girl go. So we got engaged 6 weeks after we met. Kay has so many different interests, which I find fascinating. She's an accomplished musician, and when she was younger, she and her parents would perform for senior citizens. Her mother would dance, her father would sing, and Kay would play the piano. Kay was even playing a piano while I was working on this video, and it was enchanting. Kay's worked as a psychologist and also enjoys tutoring children in our public schools. And it's no secret she loves our children and our granddaughter passionately. Kay helps me develop issues regarding my cases. Indeed, I wrote an article about 50 tips for practicing law, and I think Kay participated in every one of those. Amy, you asked me earlier about what accounts for our enduring marriage. And I suppose in our case, it's separate bathrooms and separate stockbrokers and having time alone. But we also share similarities. We have similar family backgrounds, and we both have professional degrees. And we share a love of history. We even visited battlefields together. On one occasion, I remember Kay even corrected the park ranger. Our political views are similar, but Kay is much more of an activist than I. She has a passion for politics and an understanding of what is right and wrong. Everyone says Kay is the nicest person in the world, and she really is. She's very patient with me and keeps me from beaming off the planet. Kay's the better half of me, and I adore her. And I think her music dictates the rhythm of her life. My grandparents gave me really good advice. They said, David, look, your father married a beautiful woman who was smart enough to see the good in him. And maybe when the time comes, you should marry a smart, beautiful woman as well. I certainly met a brilliant and beautiful woman at that dance. I'm going to spend the rest of my life with that girl, and I'm not going to let her go.
And I love that you have son Ben, and Ben you took to school every morning, and now he takes you to work every day.
He does. We have a carpool. He drops Layla off at school, and then Kay picks the baby up after school, takes her home, and then Ben and I arrange for I to pick the baby up house. So it's kind of a role reversal. I would take them both to school. Kay took them to school also. We take them to school, and now Ben picks me up every day, picking up this morning. We talk about our cases. He's at practice with me, but it's a complete role reversal now. And he got out of law. He went to Vanderbilt. Ben's wanted to be a lawyer since he was 4 years old. He's always wanted to be an attorney. He went to University of Chicago, went to Vanderbilt Law School. He coaches in the court at USN. Then he clerked for the federal judge, three federal judges actually, as sort of a postgraduate thing, and then came to our firm and does litigation, does a lot of criminal defense. That is the joy of my professional life, was to have him sworn in as an attorney, introduce him to the Supreme Court, and to practice with him. He has his own practice. We try cases together, but I learn more from him than he supposedly learns from me. It's just the joy of my professional life to have. I don't know if I'd still be practicing law. I still didn't have him. As I get older, I'm going to obviously not be doing this exact same thing. Kay told me the other day, don't you have somebody you need to visit at the penitentiary? Meaning get the hell out of the house. So I don't see him would be retiring and doing nothing, but I see myself going back to doing just appeals. Which is where I started, doing parole hearings, doing some mentoring, doing some counseling, doing a lot of teaching and traveling with Kay. And then more and more, Ben will just take over. I don't believe there's any such a thing as passing the torch. Ben's got his own torch. And maybe I help light his torch. And that's about the best that I can do. I guess the thesis here is, what can we pass on to the next generation? What experiences do we have? And suggest that the younger lawyers and the people who hear this can take advantage of these oral histories.